operated in a very dark place, very dingy, dimly lit, utilitarian space. And that sort of sparked my idea that I need to bring color to this. I need to bring more of an atmospheric mood, a good atmospheric mood by the choice of colors. And the colors themselves speak out. They speak volumes because just the color itself indicates that the artist is trying to retrieve or restore or actually have some valid point.
In the 1970s, New York was a dark and gray place. Decades of political mismanagement, budgetary shortfalls, explicitly racist urban renewal and highway expansion projects had taken their toll. The economy was in shambles too. At one point, chaos reigned when the city fell under a complete blackout for 2 days in 1977. And of course, public transportation was increasingly in ruins because of lack of funding and maintenance. But it was there, in the subterranean smog, that something new was growing in this city. At the moment when New York was breaking down, the subways were bursting alive with color. Young kids from poor and working class neighborhoods were becoming the leaders of a new aesthetic movement that would revolutionize the urban landscape, not just in New York City, but in cities all around the world. Graffiti in all its joyous and rebellious forms was taking over the subway, and soon it would take over the gallery world too. Welcome back to the Hyperallergic podcast. Today we have the unique pleasure and privilege to be talking with a legend of paintbrushes and spray cans, Quiñones. Lee began writing graffiti at 14 years old, and by the time he turned 16, he was already renowned for painting electrifying murals all around the city, including being part of the crew that painted the first all-over subway car. At only 19, Lee's work had been picked up by wealthy and well-connected art collector Claudino Bruni. He and Fab Five Freddy debuted their first gallery show in Galleria La Medusa in 1979, which soon led to more trips across the pond to England, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even Germany's Documenta 7 in 1982. Today, he's still innovating, with works influenced not just by his time in the train yard, but also Dada, Futurism, and his time in the East Village scene during the 80s, where he experimented alongside Keith Haring, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and others. Today, his work is held in major museums around the world. His trajectory from dazzling graffiti bombs to poetic abstraction is coming out in a new book called Quiñones, 50 Years of New York Graffiti Art and Beyond. I'm Fred Brathwaite, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. Let's get started. Hey, Lee, how's it going?
Hey, going well. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me for this talk.
A pleasure. And this is the new book, 50 Years of New York Graffiti Art and Beyond. This is a long time coming, right?
50 years.
Truly amazing. Okay, the figure on the front, how old were you here?
I was 20 to going into 21.
Wow. Okay. So what was 20-year-old Lee thinking at the time?
Well, 20-year-old Lee was reflecting on just the 6 years prior to that. I was starting with holes in my shoes, running the ties of tracks underneath the darkest tunnels, catacombs of New York. And at 16 years old, I was infamously known for my work running on the rails.
Right.
But here at 2021, the lights are on. And Cocktail Society is, pinging the glasses, and I'm wondering what this is all about and how it's gone. I knew that it was a totally new arena, a new theater of operations for me. I was now thrusted into this limelight. I was also meeting newer artists and very diverse artists, particularly in the music scene, in the poet scene. It was quite inviting, but it's also very frightening at the same time.
Right. So, and you were born in Puerto Rico, correct?
I was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico. And you arrived at a young age to New York, correct?
Yeah, I had arrived at 8 months old.
Okay. And so what was that connection with Puerto Rico for you growing up? What role did that have, would you say, in your early life and even in your early art?
I think the role that it had, that I was very enthusiastic and loud and proud, as my people are, very festive. But I also understood that there was a line on the sand between the beauty of Puerto Rico and the culture and the people there, the relaxed state of mind, as opposed to hustle bustle New York, which was going through its own challenging times. I mean,
That's right.
In the early 1960s, things are starting to get a little frail and fragile around the edges.
The city went broke by the 70s, right?
Yeah, by the 70s, I saw the progression of oppression. Right. The city was just in a fiscal crisis that had never been before, though the city had grown to a certain plateau where there was a shift in many things. I mean, the Vietnam War was just ending. In the early to mid 70s, the women's rights movement was in full swing. We were just on the outer fringes of like the civil rights movement.
The Young Lords here in New York?
The Young Lords, which represented to me, I mean, I was accustomed to seeing a lot of street gangs operating in various neighborhoods. And at that point, at that early age, I thought the Young Lords were a street gang. But I didn't understand until later on that they were actually an organization that was trying to build up equity for their own people and also some kind of good judgment and good cause. So, I heard about all these movements that were very radical at the time,
right,
theoretically radical. When one is pushing against the grain, against a big establishment, it does seem radical.
Right.
Because you have to make more noise than most.
But that's what you were doing with your early work, pushing against an establishment, right?
Sure.
You were doing the same. Did it feel like that, though?
No, I would say that the establishment wasn't even there because it felt like the city was just like, it was in disarray and dilapidated that there was not actually no operational municipality, in the city.
So like real dysfunction.
I would say an abundance of disinvestment, and there was a lot of open season, open air, and open ideas. I think the city just felt that it had to go through some kind of intermission, and that intermission was like these crazy times, these 2 or 3 areas that we had to go through, growing pains. And I just felt, wow, at that time, the only thing that I feel could reveal and heal me against what I was seeing and experiencing and hearing and seeing was the art. Very quickly, I felt that even coming in 1974 into the movement and reestablishing myself and re-triggering my batteries, if you say, I was like, this movement seems to have been stagnant for quite some time, and I think it needs quite some time. But I was like, I need to push this envelope a little further.
Love that. And so what was the first artist you were conscious of growing up? Was it a person? Was it someone in history? Like, was it a name? Do you have any recollection?
I would say that I was really attracted to cinema, film, more than the visual arts. I mean, cinema is visual arts, right? But I was attracted to cinema first and foremost. My mother was a huge film buff. I ended up at a lot of sort of red carpet events. I don't know how she finagled that. How she worked that.
It's New York.
It's New York, right? Sneak across, cross the lines and stuff. You'll get in.
Someone knows people.
Someone knows people. But, she took me to a lot of events and also just to film. So I found my first love cinematically, moving image. And it was always inviting to me, especially when it had a great music score behind it.
And are there any like early experiences at museums that made a big imprint on you?
No, not at all.
Really?
I didn't go to any museums. My mother, and when it came to the fine arts, was kind of removed from that. She was a homemaker. She stood home most of the time dealing with 4 children, me being the youngest out of 4. So it kept her unfortunately, from sort of exploring those other outer reaches of the arts. But cinema was always like a new, inviting sanctuary for most people, right? I mean, it's like it's only 30 years old since the invention of television and then theaters before that. So, to answer your question, one of my first directors was Eiichiro Honda. who created the 1954 classic Godzilla,
Right.
which was a phenomenal breakthrough at that time, conceptually, visually, and politically. And that really grabbed me. It was like this thing, this mutant thing that is created not by nature, but is a combination of lots of human behavior, which is complicated. So I looked at it as a very complicated. I wasn't entertained by that creature and the science behind it just for the, stomping buildings and walking, just being this huge menace. But I just looked at it more as a suffering creature that represented the suffering of the human condition.
Lee would also later appear in the movies himself, most famously as Raymond Zorro in the classic 1983 hip-hop film that he and his fellow graffiti writers helped create. You've probably heard of it. It's called Wild Style. In the book, Alan Schwartzman writes something that he says, all the gallery people knew who you were. Kind of like people were wondering, who's this guy doing these trains and these cars? What did it feel like at that age to know that these people who were like, do this for a living were like looking out for your work and like figuring out who you were? What did that feel like?
It was a bit of, I think the art world and its, and myself were going through a period of kind of like dating. We were trying to figure each other out. And I think that there was enough information on their desk based on hearsay or whatever for them to be enamored and sort of like, wow, who is this? Because it's curiosity kills the cat, right? But curiosity also makes people, you give someone a teaser, a trailer or something, and it's, and that reveals so
irresistible.
Much. It's irresistible, right? So, here are, a group of painters. I'm painting the majority of like these big, huge masterpieces on the sides of subway cars, 52 feet long. And people are wondering, how is that even feasible in this time and age? How is this person actually creating that and being anonymous at the same time, not announcing themselves or whatever?
Right.
That was part of the atmosphere at the time. You needed to be anonymous because it was totally against the law.
Yep, absolutely.
But it was a very influential force. And I think based on mural making, what they were calling a vile act was literally showcasing its best cards by these masterpieces that were rolling through the rail system.
Absolutely. So, that makes sense.
Yeah, it just made a lot of people in the art world wonder like, wow, this is something that's been underneath our feet, literally. And now it's surfacing. So what is to be expected?
So now, do you remember a mural or a tag or something that you first saw and you were kind of like,
I would have to say that I first saw color. Okay. Color sets the mood in any atmosphere. And I saw a lot of color, a lot of flashing, just a lot of flashes of color, not knowing that obviously the dynamic energy, the train moving in motion created this like blur of color, and those colors were part of these paintings of names. The first name that I actually came across, because I was like, wow, what does that spell out? Was a Vinny on an F train. His name was Vinny, and it was a legible V and then an I, and then the two ends were lowercase that had a little swirl on the top, so it had a little flair, a little style, and they look like lowercase a's. So I was like, Viaay? What does that? So it was very foreign to me. I was like, what's that? VA? Like I didn't understand that to even be a name. I thought maybe I didn't even put into the notion of was it an advertisement?
Right.
But I know that it was very. It had a lot of character to it, that it was done by the human hand.
It sounds like you kind of really like the mystery of it a little too. Like, what is this?
Yes, of course. And it's rolling and it's on a train. It's a boy in his train. I love trains. I still to this day look at those inanimate objects that have this real gallant presence, and the noises and the sounds and the smells that they emulate, and I loved it back then. The funny story about my mother and I, she was a very patient woman. And at that time, there was a transition from old train stock from the 1930s and 40s that was still running on the rails that were being replaced by newer stainless steel cars.
Are we talking like the red cars and that kind of stuff?
Well, the red cars were still going to be in service for a number of years,
Gotcha.
but these are what we used to call the coal mines,
Got
which
it.
were the chocolate brown iron
right.
clad with riveted sides and the fans and the straw seats. They were still running all the way to like 1975, 76. And I loved them because they came into the train station with a lot of character. And I didn't love this, but I'd say, Mom, we have to wait for one of those trains, which were far in between sometimes.
Oh, that's awesome.
So she would wait there. I guess she had a lot of patience or we had a lot of time. Either one of those two or the combination of both. But we would wait for like 3 sets of stainless steel trains coming through, which had their own character. Though to me, they were very sterile and surgical. Whereas these trains came in, the old trains had character and like old New York scent and smell and, you know.
And which kid doesn't like chocolate? I mean, even the way you say it.
Right.
Chocolate colored strings.
Right. Funny enough, I don't like chocolate, but they look like chocolate bars, you know, with very incandescent, Edison lighted interiors, really dim, like that old New York from the 40s, which obviously I didn't experience, but I saw the remnants of it in the early 60s. So anyway, I was in love with that, and I saw this Vinny, and I was like, wow, what is that? And then I connected the dots once in my neighborhood. I saw more and more people involved, immersed in the practicing of creating a name, a persona for themselves, and then creating style around that persona.
And how about the first painting you ever saw? Because you're a painter at heart. You know, that's what you're doing. That's what you do. I mean, in many ways, it sort of is the common thread that kind of goes through all your art. Do you remember the first painting or maybe the first painting that made a real impression?
I think the first work of art that I saw that I was more impressed by and in wonderment was an actual sculpture.
That's unexpected.
Trying to remember his name, Tony Rosenthal.
Oh, wow.
Tony Rosenthal created a piece called 5 in 1. And there were like 5 discs that were actually welded, like leaning against each other, like sort of using their own forces to sort of sustain themselves and erect.
The gravity and stuff.
Yeah, and it was really an interesting sculpture, and it was brought over to the then One Police Plaza, which was across the street from the projects where I grew up at.
Got it.
So I was always walking by the sculpture with my parents, and then by myself, and then with my friends. And with my friends, we ended up climbing on it every other day. It was like a ritual for us to run up on it and climb to the very top, right there in front of Police Plaza. I'm like, wow, I'm surprised that we weren't even like people, you know, police officers didn't come out and say, hey guys, get over that. So I was always, really involved with this sculpture, and that was one of the first pieces that I actually. That was really long-standing for me in memory.
I love that because it sort of tells me that for you, art was always kind of more interactive, you know, or at least that's the way you sort of approached it at first. It wasn't this like, oh no, I need to stand back here. And sort of like, so, and who taught you can control or to actually use spray paint?
Who taught me that?
Yeah. Did anyone teach you that?
Self-taught.
Self-taught. Wow.
I mean, you know, it's all an experiment.
Right.
Art in itself is an experiment of failures and, you know, achievements or whatever. You know, knowing certain brands of paint are better than others, they react and behave a certain way is always paramount to like your practice. I've always been sort of a representational painter.
Right.
So on that note alone, I was always accustomed to looking through the lens of cinema. Right? Looking at light, shadow, temperature in the room. The challenge to myself was to create an atmosphere of realism around my work so that it could also circumvent like the practitioner of just your name on the side of a train. I wanted to create works that would be like, wow, that's beyond. Hence the word in the book itself and beyond. Right. It's a magic word. Beyond has always been part of my practice, to go beyond the boundaries, the theoretical limitations that people throw on you. So that made me always aware to challenge myself through the use of spray paint and knowing which ones work better than others, which ones have a better palette, because it's always a challenge to make something really incredible out of a spray can. It's a tool that's very compressed, and it's always pushing itself off the surface.
Lee's 1979 painting of Howard the Duck is considered the first entire handball court mural in New York City. Howard quivers behind a garbage can lid, which becomes a makeshift shield he uses to defend himself from letters spelling Lee. And those seem to burst out of the stone wall. Above his moniker, written in white letters, is "Stop the Draft." And above the duck's sweating forehead, he wrote, "Graffiti is a art. And if art is a crime, let God forgive all." So this is the work I feel like is probably your earliest well-known work, perhaps.
Above ground.
Above ground, that's right. Howard the Duck from 1978. And the sketch itself is part of the Martin Wong collection. Now, tell me a little bit about this piece, because I think it sort of encapsulates a lot of what comes afterward, right? Like, it's sort of this sense of time, a bit of social commentary, but at the same time, it feels very accessible and easy to be interpreted by people in different ways. But you also bring these little philosophical touches, right? You know, at the top left, it says graffiti is art, and if art is crime, let God forgive us, or something.
Right.
And so it's like, forgive us all, to be correct. And, you know, "Stop the Draft" is written on this. There are different like messages. He's coming out of a garbage can. Tell me a little bit about this and how you see this now in retrospect.
Well, obviously DC Comics and all the underground comics of the time, I was drawn to Howard the Duck over Daffy Duck, Donald Duck, and even there was one duck that was sort of like X-rated. I think it might have been done by what's his name from Fritz the Cat's fame.
Oh, right.
It might have been Dirty Duck. Yeah, I think it was called Dirty Duck.
Right.
He was sort of like a flasher,
that's right.
which was I was like, okay, that's not the subject matter I'm trying to project here. I just felt that what Howard the Duck represented was an outsider, someone on the fringes of conservatism, and that he was dressed for the part. He was not on his Sunday's best, but on his midnight best.
Right.
Like very dapper, Don, very sophisticated dress code, but also very much in the trenches, boots on the ground kind of experience and savviness. And when I saw this comic, I forget which edition it is, I saw him in a garbage can. There was sitting inside of a garbage can using the lid as a sort of a shield.
Right.
I felt that was representational of like what art was for me as a shield in the breaking down of New York City at the time. Now, this is 1978 at 18 years old.
Oh, exactly.
By that time, I had exhausted everything that could ever be done on a subway train.
Right.
And I'm only 4 years in. So you could just imagine 1974 to 1978, the rapid pace, how fast it just developed itself with the help of, you know, a little flavor of competition, intuition, and just pushing the envelope, breaking boundaries. I think that's what art is all about. It's not always about being stuck in something that's very popular, but to go against the grain. And this is Howard representing going against the grain.
Love
now, he's protecting himself from Lee.
Right.
So I'm being protected and shielded by him. It's sort of a juxtaposed between two characters that are very complicated and maybe very frightened.
Right.
By the environment, and that my protection is my glare. The fact that the Lee sort of trickles down and has this lightning bolt at the end of the letters shows that I am in control of my power. I am my own thunder. I am a silent thunder. And then the glow of the nuclear explosion around it sort of indicates that I am nuclear. I am very unpenetrable. But Howard the Duck, on the other end, is shielding himself from that, but we're sort of complementing each other. And it was that wall that I felt above ground on a stationary object that I had arrived as an artist.
Really?
Yeah. And that's where that saying on the very top left of it is what sparked that whole notion came into play. I was like, I am an artist. I am a person of credibility. I am not dysfunctional. I am not dismissing myself or dismissing society. I'm trying to bring society in. And that's why that piece became sort of more of a neighborhood prescription.
Right. It sounds like you kind of caught a little bit of that, what people were feeling in their own lives, in different ways. Because here I see the ego of an artist who knows they have talent and wants to make a difference in the world and so many things, but also this other figure who's also like trying to figure it out. And I feel like there's this complexities coming through, and the way you're talking about it is exactly what I think I can see too. So it's like, I just love that energy, and the color of this piece is really wonderful too. And it really goes against the grain of a lot of what the art world at that time was considered like good art necessarily too. I mean, at that point, were you looking at any of the art in galleries, and did you feel alienated by it? Did you feel there was a connection there? What were you thinking?
Well, to be honest, I wasn't looking at any art. It was a very minimal stage era.
But can I assume that you were looking at things like album covers, things like that? Because there's a little bit of that vibe going on here too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the established art world, I was not even taking any second looks at it at all. I was looking at a lot of album art. I was looking at a lot of advertisements that were plastered all over the subways, both on the trains themselves and the platforms. So there was a lot of color in that. Now, mind you, this is a very dark age for New York City, and maybe from a lot of the rest of the country. And I came from a very dark place. I operated in a very dark place, very dingy, dimly lit, utilitarian space. And that sort of sparked my idea that I need to bring color to this. I need to bring more of an atmospheric mood, a good atmospheric mood by the choice of colors. And the colors themselves speak out. They're sort of they speak volumes, because it just the color itself indicates that the artist is trying to retrieve or restore or actually have some valid point.
Right.
And this was in that neighborhood, which was very dilapidated, and on the fringes.
Which neighborhood was this?
This is the Lower East Side.
Lower East Side, okay.
We call it the lower level, or the lower deck, because it's below the avenue, which is known as Alphabet City.
Right.
A lot of people look at it as the Lower East Side, but the lower is below that, and that's where I grew up.
Right. So one of the things in this book that I thought was a real revelation was this wanted poster. This is real? There was a wanted poster for you in 1977, put out by like the local police department, housing authority. Is that true?
Yeah. That
I mean, that's crazy to me. Saying you were called George Graffiti.
Yeah, because they didn't know, they couldn't, my actual signature of my middle name, Lee, was unlegible to them. So everyone knew me from my first name, which is actually Jorge, not George,
funny.
but Jorge Lee Quiñones. They couldn't put those dots together. So by hearsay, it's like, yes, that kid George who lives
right.
So that poster was plastered in all 12 or 11 of the buildings in the facility where I grew up. And I happened to grab that one, which was in my building.
That's
and
amazing.
I kept it. I'm sort of I kept it just as a joke, like, oh my God, look at this, these guys,
That's crazy. Do you think that influenced why you chose the name Lee more later? Or because, you don't use George?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Lee was just there. Okay. I mean, my mother was in love with a lot of actors that had,
Gotcha.
the Lee name, Lee Marvin, Christopher Lee, again, cinema. And I think that's where it comes from, just keeping, also, the quickness and the rapidness of creating a name or writing a name that has very few letters in it was very, strategically, was very important to.
Easier to write quickly, too.
Exactly. Everything's on the quick, right? Everything is literally on the quick.
And then, of course, The Lion's Den from 1982, I feel like is probably the most iconic in terms of what people may know from your early work. I mean, it has a very distinctive look. It's sort of like, when I thought of your work first thing, I thought of this one. Lion's Den is a seminal work of the golden years of graffiti. Anyone familiar with the era will have inevitably seen Martha Cooper's classic photograph of two kids playing handball in the early 80s, with a sinewy lion roaring in a chain-filled dungeon. A candelabra, spider webs, and green cowering skeletons complete the scene. This time, the letters making out Lee glow in iridescent blue. It's a poignant snapshot of the era. What role did this one play in your career? Or what do you think? Why do you think people resonate with it?
You know, I'll tell you a little story behind that piece. Short story is that I actually got permission to do that side of the wall from the school itself. Long story short, they seeked me out, found me in my classroom. I had left the school already, and they had asked me, can you come back and paint the wall? I was very skeptical and very suspicious of, wow, the dean and the principal of my junior high school was asking of me, you know, who I am. So I was in denial of who I was. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not me. They were like, well, it's got to be you. Everyone has told us that it's you. I was like, well, everyone has their own opinion. You know,
you had to be a little quieter, maybe.
Yeah, it's a little incognito, you know, like, so I didn't know what was the intention of these guys. They eventually broke down. I said, listen, if you want me to do that wall, then you need to write on your letterhead, give me a permission slip, write it, and I'll have that on my person when I create this wall. So the night I painted that wall,
Please tell me you kept that letter.
I did. I still have it. I still have it. That's for another volume of the book. Trust me. I kept that letter. I kept it in my mother's house that night, and I went to the wall without it, intentionally, wanting to see if I can actually create this persona of like this legitimate work of art being created, even though in the dead of night, but that I can walk and talk myself out of this situation if anything went awry. So I again, like the one on the opposite side, Howard the Duck, I painted the whole thing in one night. It was the first of its kind in many ways, this particular piece, because it was the first time that I was experimenting with shadowing and actual no outline to the actual characters or the items in the piece. So I was creating, again, working with light, the effect of light and shadow and lack of light with certain colors and hues that I discovered in the stores. Now, mind you, some of these cans came from Europe because by this time in 1980, 1982, I'm already traveling back and forth to Europe.
Got it.
And I was discovering this whole new palette of paint, spray paints out there.
What brands were they?
The first brand that I encountered was called K Car, and it was a car. It was a car paint.
Oh, got it.
And it Auto K. That's what's the name of it. I started bringing it on my person on the plane as early as 1979, 1980. So I was going back and forth to Europe, bringing back cans of paint that were not available here, obviously, and colors that had never been seen. So when dudes were like, cats in the arena were like, where'd you get that hue of green or olive drab? I'm like, yeah. I would like sort of divert the attention.
You're like Europe.
I would not.
Oh, you would?
I never revealed it. I would say, no, it's at the Lamston's down the street or the Woolworths. They got a whole new stash of new colors, not knowing that 10 years later, not knowing that a year later, the paint companies here would start shifting towards a bigger palette of color.
Gotcha.
So there was a lot of things that came into play at the same time, simultaneously. I started bringing colors because I was like, there's a lack of color here. So I need to bring my own color palette to the game and create my own atmospheric effects on the works.
So what is this piece about for you? Because, you know, it's like there's something about it that feels very like Disney, but there's something really loud and proud. Now that you talk about film, I think of the MGM lion even. You know, I think about all like what you're trying to express. I'd love to hear it from you.
Yeah, well, the MGM lion is a big influence. Obviously, seeing the lion represents the gatekeeper of any jungle. I felt New York was a jungle.
Yep.
I'm a Leo. I'm actually a really complicated Leo. I'm a triple Leo. So it's moon, sun, and rising all in the same in the mane of the hair, the hair mane of the lion. I wanted to just represent like a whole new, more less animated figure to also be at this point protecting the name. This is not shielding itself from the name, but actually protecting it, because now I'm starting to see a number of things unfolding. Not only is New York still falling apart, but also what's falling apart for me was the transition from the subway era, transitioning to an established artist in the art world, which was very frightening to me. And that transition was very, very difficult for me because I didn't know anything about the dialogue, and how you operate in that, just a very
structured world. Maybe?
Structured world. Yeah. So here the line was representing me and sort of being my head of security as I walked through the gauntlet of all this new experimental stage in the art world.
Right. I love that. And both these murals we've talked about, so the first one, the Howard the Duck, and this one, the Lion's Den, they're both dedicated to your mom.
Every work of mine was dedicated to my mother.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So that relationship must have been really important for you, or throughout your life. How would you describe in terms of her support of your art or the way you saw the world?
I mean, like any parent, she probably was frightened out of her shoes, out of her sleep for sure, every night when I was out.
Right.
She must have looked at something, a gleam in my eye, a glitter or whatever. When I told her straight up, I said, Mom, I'll always come home to you. Don't you worry about me. I fear no evil in the valley of death because I am the meanest SOB in the valley of death. And, it was a very loving home. I knew that she had good intent. She had a good heart. My dad at the time as well. Very hardworking Puerto Ricans that came here after World War II. And were living in a very transitioning city and also neighborhood that was very challenged. Not just my people of color that were challenged, but people of all color that were being challenged at that time. And I think through all that mess, that fog of war, she probably had a little hint that the art that I was creating was something that was not dysfunctional and missing the mark, that I was creating some kind of a new platform for myself. And I saw it in her by her patience.
Supportive parents are amazing.
They so much are. I mean, they're so ahead of the curve as well.
Yeah.
Though she wanted me to be a postal clerk for security, for economic, and I was like, Mom, being an artist was like way far. I mean, she never mentioned you should be a lawyer or a doctor, because that idea would never present itself in the situation that I was in. Being a postal clerk was more of a
stable job, paid well, right? Absolutely.
Right. At that time. So being an artist was way on another planet. It was, it was on the red planet at that time.
So what are the skeletons here in this thing? Is it like the old guard? Is it the old world? I mean, because they're being stabbed by these swords, right? So who are these skeletons?
These skeletons are the people in my neighborhood that I saw not only being manipulated, but succumbing to the pressures of the neighborhood at that time. And it just represented like maybe an old guard, but a guard that fell, and that the lion is a refreshing reminder that the chain behind it represents that you can be chained by your own limitations.
Yeah.
And this was a challenge for me to say, I am still here. I am relevant. This movement is very relevant. And the flashes of light being the first of their kind, little hues of that's right there. Those little hints in the painting, the light at the end of the tunnel. That's what it represents. And that's why I put them strategically, very tastefully in very small places in the work, so that they're not so obvious.
Yeah.
Is that you have to look for them just like you have to look for your achievements in the struggle of life. Nothing comes easy. If you're spoon-fed success, you have no great story to tell.
Right.
If you come from struggle, from a brash environment that challenges your ideals, your politics, your sexuality, everything, if you go against that grain and you have a struggle, you have a better story to tell.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I get that. By the early 1980s, Lee was becoming a fixture of the burgeoning East Village art scene. There, as punk and hip-hop was playing on the stereos, contemporary artists like Jenny Holzer came together with graffiti writers and street artists like Basquiat and Lady Pink, and queer innovators like David Wojnarowicz and Keith Haring. And they were also backed by risk-taking gallerists like Patty Astor, as many of you may know as the founder of the infamous Fun Gallery, which was very influential at the time. Some, of course, stayed true to the rebellious anti-authoritarian spirit of experimentation more than others. Looking at you, Jeff Koons. The scene gave birth to alternative schools of thought that embraced counterculture, color, fun, and figuration melding together with abstraction, and it changed the course of the art world itself. So now, let's fast forward a little bit. The East Village scene, which you were a part of, you showed at Fun Gallery, a number of other things. You were running with a number of really well-known artists, everyone from Basquiat to others. Now, what was this was there a real sense of camaraderie? Did you all have each other's back? Was it just a coincidence you all sort of ended up at this place? How would you characterize that?
You know, it's funny. Keith Haring, bless his soul, was very, very supportive. And I think he immersed himself in the scene more than most other artists did of the time. You know, I hung out with Francesco Clemente and Schnabel and Jonathan Borowski and Jenny Holzer, a number of people, Judy Rivka. We sort of mingled in the same spaces and same openings, same clubs in most cases.
Mud Club, where are the places?
Yeah, the Mud Club was one of them. The Paradise Garage was another. The World, Danceteria, a lot of the underground, like the Ones and CBGBs. You know, a number of these clubs, which were very instrumental in sort of gathering all of us under one roof and being able to have a discourse, you know, an exchange with each other was great. But I never felt the camaraderie as I did from cats like Keith Haring, who were involved in the street, and Jean-Michel Basquiat, and a number of other notable characters.
Yeah. How was that? How was that? How was the East Village scene? Did it blow your mind? I mean, was it sort of you're I don't know if I trust these people? I mean, what was the general vibe for you?
It's funny, even in the subway era, I felt that there were times that I needed to be very savvy about how I operated and who I spoke with, shared information with. That didn't really come into re-effect or back into play once I was creating works that were now for consumption, and wanting to keep my work original and keep it under wraps until I felt it was good to lease it to the rest of the world. So there was that transition time that it was very open market, very open-minded, experimental, alternative music, alternative film, alternative, poetry, radical or not, and the visual arts. And then in comes this flash dance, this attitude of dance and posture and style and fashion. MTV, everything gets introduced and thrown into the mixer all at once. And it was really fun. It was a lot of experimental and not necessarily success.
Right.
It was all about, the
trying things, right?
Failure was success in itself.
Right. That's right.
So, and I don't even think we thought of things as failure. It was just, that's just another peg in the ladder of experimentation. So it was very relaxing at that time. Plus, you could bartend one night, as the late great Glenn O'Brien said, you could bartend one night and have your rent paid, and the rest was gravy. The rest was butter. So you had a lot of time to actually marinate and ingest and investigate the world around you. In our case, New York City, which seemed to me like the world.
Right.
You had that time to actually look into that and let it reflect in your work.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So one of the myths, I think, of the 80s in the East Village and the MTV is the fact that graffiti writers and everything was related to hip hop, right? But what my experience talking to writers from the 70s and stuff is the musical tastes of the scene were much more diverse. Can you tell us a little bit about what were people listening to? What was the inspiration coming from? I mean, I've heard people mention Pink Floyd. What was the sort of soundscape of that era?
Yeah, I think it depended a lot on the demographics, which particular neighborhood you was living and growing up, and which neighborhoods you actually ventured into. Right. So I ventured all over the city. I've been almost in every neighborhood, almost know the streets better than a taxi driver. Oh yeah, I was there in 1975. Yeah, I went there in 73. I was over there in 1985. Being able to spread your wings and break open beyond your block, because most people never left the block. Right. They were comfortable in their little, sanctuaries of the block, and whatever was playing there at the time, and sort of on the loudspeakers or on the street jams was what you based your playing list on. I was always playing music since day one because my mother was always playing music. And then films always had music scores involved in them, right? So, from West Side Story, listening and seeing and experiencing that iconic film made in 1960 or whenever it was, it was amazing to see my own culture, Puerto Ricans, coexisting and sort of mingling and maybe in friction with other cultures at the time, Irish, Italian. So that kind of like opened up my aperture of like thought of music, but also listening to just being sort of more attracted to obviously funk and soul, Motown at that time. And then eventually rock.
Right.
Rock was really, soft rock and then heavy rock after that. But, I was listening to, and I loved him and I love him to this day, Elton John.
Right.
I was listening to a lot of Elton John. I was listening to a lot of Dennis Coffey. I was listening later on to Grace Jones and then, Isaac Hayes and Baby Huey, all these different genres of music, funk, soul, blues, all coming in. I just felt like that I needed to have a bigger menu to actually experience all the different things that are happening simultaneously at the many intersections in the city. So it was a very democratic listening list and I'm not the only one.
Right.
I know many writers that were themselves listening to a lot of, Jefferson Starship, and then they would listen to, Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan was a person that I discovered way after in the 80s and started listening to his music. I was like, oh my God, his lyrics and the music and the way he delivered the piece was like painting to me. It was my paintings in music sense. Because he was sort of almost creating a barrier and a wall against the Vietnam War.
Right.
It's amazing.
So now your first time working on canvas and actually on movable objects like that, what was different for you? Because, one of the other parts in this book that I found interesting is William Cordova's piece where he talks about your work as time-based art. And I think a lot of people, obviously graffiti tends to be time-based because it gets buffed and all the other things. But did you really kind of have that feeling for yourself, or like what changed for you when doing on canvases versus on walls?
But what happened was a little thing known as the buff. The buff is when all my work on the trains was totally whitewashed away. Not faded away, but whitewashed away. And that was a death that I had to deal with because it took so long. In a very short time, it took so long to actually create.
Right.
In your head, you're thinking, sleeping, eating, this culture. You're really, really deep sea diving in this culture. And for it to just disappear almost overnight, I had to come to the very difficult conclusion that was the chapter that got me to this new chapter, canvas, where now the work will live forever. And even then, to be accepted as an artist in that realm, in that theater of creating works on canvas, creating sculptures and creating wall pieces and murals was already a challenge because I was still designated as, those vile kids, we were not kids. We were young people that had a vision. We were not dysfunctional. We were not, we weren't misdirecting ourselves. We had an agenda. And I felt that my agenda was to create work that would outlast my living self, and that it would be relevant of the time and it would be relevant beyond that time. And I think that great art has a way of reintroducing itself and re-triggering an idea and conversation over the course of time. And the thing about this movement that it always runs along with time as it changes, because I don't know how to phrase it, but the art reflects the moment. And I think that that's the beauty of this particular movement, that it is an art that lives within the moment and lives beyond, and it lives in the past as well.
Right. So where were those ideas coming from for you? Because, I mean, those are pretty ambitious ideas, right? I'm just wondering, is it just you sort of decided at one point? Was this like just among your crew or people that you were talking to, I should say? Like, did you all just sort of decide this is what you wanted to do? You wanted to make it last? I mean, I guess where's that urge coming from?
Yeah, it's curiosity of like creating something finally under light, creating something not having to look over my shoulder, and creating something that is literally not moving and that I can actually have a nice long conversation with. Because everything was done before that was done very rapidly under the cover of darkness and then staying undercover when it was out in the wild, as I say. So being anonymous for obvious reasons, being the most wanted graffiti artist in New York for 2 years in a row because I was an influence, as I was told, was very powerful, but also very frightening.
What years were those?
That was 1977, 1978.
Wow.
Consecutively. And I was 17 going into 18 years old.
Who knocked you off the top of the list?
I don't know. But I think the whole movement, by the time 1980 came through, that whole transition was happening. The MTA was still discounting what had happened, but there was a huge shift, seismic shift of interest towards the arts above ground because, again, it was a way of preservation, self-preservation.
As the broken windows philosophy began growing in popularity in the early 1980s, graffiti was quickly being associated with crime rather than the creative, artistic outlet Lee and his fellow writers saw it as. Police surveillance, razor wire, acid washes, and even vicious guard dogs were being used to fight a war against graffiti and artists like Lee. It's ironic, of course, because graffiti is probably one of the most globally influential art movements associated with the city.
And even on the trains, it was self-preservation because the work can move very dynamically all around and be almost unapproachable and unlegible and be secret in a way, like in a superhero sense.
Yeah.
Be very secret.
Like coded.
Yeah, very coded. And be anonymously fulfilled. And here I am creating works that are stationary, that are not moving anymore, but I'm creating movement within the canvas. I'm creating the movement of conversation. Conversation is movement because it creates a whole new, it creates another plateau, another platform, another ideal, another vibe. That's the beauty of conversation. And if art can encompass that and not be stale and frail, it's great art. It's great work.
Lee's work, of course, changed when his painting moved from the streets into a studio, but it also never stopped changing. His body of work defies categorization. Works like Tablet number 28 from 2005 are filled with bright swaths of color, dotted with lines of poetry and light figurative drawings. In Utica from 2021, he shows his mastery of depicting real life as a figure leaps across as the bright lights of a train are rattling towards him. Lee's constant experimentation leads to a body of work that is never stagnant. But that constantly changing nature is the very same through line you can see in all of his paintings. There is always a sense of movement, a force propelling the image forward into something new. So let's fast forward to the 21st century. Where's this coming from for you then?
A lot of these works come from me enabling myself to look at my past with a much more mature sense of things and reflecting on those things and why they happened and why I thought of them in certain ways and how I think of them now, 50 years later. It's a lot of it reflected in my recent series, which is ongoing, what I call the Tablet series, where I do a lot of writing, but it's all spontaneous and very urgent. So I don't look around for that pad because the idea that the words may slip my mind like right there and then. So I just write it on the walls.
Right.
So the writing is on the wall, right? Literally.
Literally.
It's these poetic ways that I like to write that actually become paintings later on. So some of these are already paintings in their own way. But sometimes I need to write them because they are sort of like a hint of a painting, of a vibe in the room, more than just words, and sometimes a painting needs words to give it a little push, or actually to put all the parts together, because everything is subjective in art, right? You look at art one way, someone else sees it the other. And sometimes words have a way of bringing those two different views and creating like the wow moment, the light bulb moment.
Totally. I see in these works this century, there seems to be sort of a rethinking of the wall. Or am I right? I don't know, but there feels like there's like consciousness remixing of this kind of past and present. I don't know what it is. I'd love to hear a little bit about that, because, there's like, they both feel they're part of the wall, but they're clearly not, right? And there's like something going on there. What's that tension?
Yeah, I look at whatever's going on there. First of all, is a lot of his sort of subconsciousness floating in the present. Like I like to say that the words are sort of lifted off the wall itself. It's almost like they're living right in front of you, around you, in you, and not necessarily on that wall.
Right.
To me, those writings seem to be like they're separated from the wall. The wall is just a sort of background filler for the strength of what those words are saying. So they're very minimal to me and abstract, and yet very representational at the same time. They're literally the studio walls.
Right.
I've cut them out of my previous studios that I've had in the past, just because when I walked away from the studio, I was like, wow, the studio walls look a lot more inviting than my own paintings. So I just love preserving that. They all become testimonials to my time at that time.
Right.
And some of them are just way ahead of their time.
Well, I mean, there's some beautiful stuff here, Lee. I just want to say thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was an absolute pleasure, and you've been so generous with your time. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
The new book on Lee's work is titled Lee Quiñones, 50 Years of New York Graffiti, Art and Beyond, and it was just published by Damiani at the end of April. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you had as much fun listening as we had putting this one together. Our membership is the main supporter of our podcast, so thank you as always to all the Hyperallergic members out there. You make a difference. I'm Fred Brathwaite, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Hyperallergic. We'll see you next time.